Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gen AI Talk in 10, brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. I'm Brad. He's Satish. Satish, let's talk about the responsible AI framework. Why don't you start by just explaining what it is?
Thank you, Brad. It's one of the most important things that we see consistently across our customers, right? Our customers do talk about using the responsible AI framework. So it's really important for us to know what it is. So it's really a set of guidelines and best practices that are designed to ensure that AI is developed and deployed in an ethical, a responsible, and accountable manner. It actually focuses on a few things, right? It's about transparency. You've heard about explainability, for example, right? It's a different way of saying transparency. It's about fairness. It's about inclusivity, because you hear about AI models having bias, right? So this inclusivity is to prevent bias and discrimination, right? That's potentially possible by using AI applications. The AI framework actually usually you see that it has four parts. There's privacy and security, which means you're talking about protecting user data and ensuring secure operation so that you prevent unauthorized access and misuse of information. That's number one. Safety and security. This is guaranteeing that the AI system will function as intended, right? You're saying that the AI system will work in a certain way, it has to work that same way for every single interaction you have. So it's resilient to failures or errors. It includes things like preventing hackers from modifying the output from the AI system or application. You may or may not have heard of. Now I'm talking to our audience. Brad, I know you have heard of prompt injection, and we have heard maybe of red teaming, right? Red teaming is where you're stress testing the model so that you're confident in the model performing as it is designed, right? The third thing is transparency. We've also seen people refer to this as explainability or traceability. It's providing clarity around how AI systems operate, making, when the AI gives a decision, how do it arrive at that decision? How do it arrive at that output? Clear to us, right? Why is an LLM coming up with a certain response, and how did it come up with that response, right? Those kinds of things are transparency. And the last one, this is the hardest problem we have these days, is fairness, right? This is where we are ensuring that the AI system will treat everybody, either individuals or groups, by avoiding bias and discrimination. Now, turns out it's not necessary that somebody is doing this intentionally, right? It just so happens, because we talked about training models, the trained data might itself be biased, and it was not somebody who intended to really marginalize one group or the other or individuals. It just so happens that the data might be, the data we picked might be biased, or might, move the decision in a certain direction and output in a certain way.
Right.
Those are the four things, right? Just to kind of summarize, it's privacy and security, safety, it's transparency, it's fairness.
I'm assuming there will be differences between how each company may go at each of those four things. So talk about that if you would.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When we speak to customers, and Brad, you've been part of some of these conversations where we ask them, how do they set up governance models? How do they take care of privacy and security? They usually talk about the provider that they're getting their models from, and following the responsible AI framework that has been, because they are they're aligned to that approach. And so they feel like it's the most feasible thing to do given they're using the model from that provider. So if you look at the top 3 providers, as we know, it's really Microsoft, it's Amazon, it's Google, right? And then there are open source models and other domain specific models and so on. Now, most of these large providers have a responsible AI framework defined, right? Turns out most of them have it defined around those 4 things we talked about, right? The privacy, the safety and security, etc. Now, this implementation of it might be slightly different based on their reference architecture and so on. But the idea is almost the same, right? In terms of, what does responsible AI mean and what outcomes are they driving towards? It's almost similar or same, right? How they get there might be a little different because say your vendor is Amazon versus Microsoft. How to get there might be slightly different based on the architecture. Or did something like even Salesforce, right, which could still use one of the major models, but they might have their own flavor of responsible AI framework, that they have. So it's really what, these companies resonate with, that they see out there, that they'll use. But rest assured that responsible AI framework really, foundationally speaking, has very similar tenets, if you will.
Who are the key stakeholders involved with the responsible AI framework?
For answering that question, we should look at the value chain, right? Because a lot of companies will have maybe suppliers or vendors they work with. They have internal employees all the way from the teams on the ground to the executives. And then there are customers. So at a high level, maybe you can also throw in partners if you want a fourth stakeholder in there. If you look at a company that's providing a service, they might rely on a software or a widget that they buy from a vendor or a piece of code or whatever it is, right? If that is broken and they plug it into their responsible AI framework, they just broke their framework, right? So similarly, if you implement the responsible AI framework, but employees are not in compliance, now you're not clearly using the framework anymore. Likewise, when customers interact with the company and there is in those interactions, some of that framework is not followed, then again, they're an important stakeholder and that impacts the customer, right? So that's how we see it. Now, granted, some of the stakeholders, they have a lot more at stake, if you will, to use a pun or to use a part of the word stakeholders. Like for example, executives, the CXO ranks within companies have a lot more at stake. If something bad goes wrong and they get bad press, we know whose heads will typically roll, right? So they have to be probably more in tune with what's going on in terms of these deployments and how we are managing the value chain of stakeholders that exist. But, hopefully this gives our listeners a good idea of the stakeholders.
Yeah, it really does. And we don't have time to cover the breadth of the regulatory aspect of AI. We'll cover that in another one, but maybe you could just briefly speak to the relationship between regulations that come from the government at different levels and the responsible AI framework.
Yeah. See, I like that you're broadening the lens now, right? Because the stakeholder also can be the government to an extent, right? Even though they're not involved in the day-to-day, the regulations, if you look at some of the latest regulations, and we'll talk about regulations in detail in a future episode, but SB 1047, which is one of the regulations that came out in California, if you look at that regulation, it's about, injury caused by models built by companies that have spent more than $100 million or whatever the threshold was. The intent was, hey, if you are building a model, you better make sure that model, when it gives an output that's being used to do business, be reliable, credible, and trustworthy, right? Because otherwise there's downstream impact. So this idea of there being a consequence if things are not followed according to certain rules to play by. Yeah, that's a fascinating topic, and it'll take us a longer time.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk more about that, and I know we will discuss that in a future episode.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you next time on Gen AI Talk in 10.